Most people had never heard about Uyghurs, who lived for the most part in northwestern China and the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, while a small number live in Central Asian republics. They came to the forefront when Muslim NBA star Enes Kanter Freedom, born in Turkey, became a primary voice attacking the woke and celebrity hypocrisy over their claims of concern for human rights, while continuing to make millions knowing that slave labor is making them wealthy. Who are the Uyghurs? Why are they targeted by the Communist Chinese government? Why do millionaires and American corporations still do business in China knowing the human rights abuses? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Uyghurs are a minority in Communist China, which long ago banned religion, and this ethnic group of Turkic origins has been targeted for being Muslim. Uyghurs are the largest single minority group enslaved in the gulags of Communist China. It has been estimated that more than 1 million Uyghur people have been detained in slave labor camps, where they have been subjected to torture, forced labor, religious restrictions, rape, murder, and even forced sterilization. Enes Freedom called out his own country of Turkey for blatant human rights abuses and was met with death threats and labeled a terrorist in retaliation. Upon becoming an American citizen, he took the surname Freedom because that is what he is fighting for. He exposed the human rights abuses in China that make Americans rich, the same wealthy liberals who claim to support human rights. He also challenged his fellow basketball players for their hypocrisy. Players like LeBron James and others, while publicly supporting the domestic terror group Black Lives Matter and demanding human rights, were making millions of dollars off the slave labor in China. Their paid endorsements for products such as Nike sports shoes and other commodities illustrated that they were far more concerned with financial success than they were human rights. Freedom was thrown out of the NBA because he exposed their double standards and embarrassed them. But why would the Chinese target the Uyghurs? The answer is simple: prejudice and profit. American and other international companies went to China years ago after the cost of doing business, especially corporate taxes, drove their businesses overseas. Many countries began seeing their businesses going to Asia, and locations such as China, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Cambodia saw their gross domestic product increase as a result. But China is different. They needed cheap labor to make the most profit for their foreign benefactors, as well as for their own country. Their excuse to target minority groups, especially the Uyghurs, came with a bang. Following the attacks on the United States on September 11, 2001, China used that event as a pretext to target Muslims inside China. The CCP started a campaign in Xinjiang against what they called the three evils: terrorism, extremism, and separatism. China was on the rise as an industrial giant. By combining stolen Western intellectual property and technology, the CCP needed a cheap labor force. By labeling the Muslim minority as a domestic security threat, they began one of the largest roundups of human beings since the Second World War. As Enes Freedom exposed these practices, being concerned for his fellow Muslims, and just trying to bring these practices into the public forum, he specifically named Nike and LeBron James, among many others. To his credit, and to the New York Times' credit, both exposed the CCP campaign to systematically disappear, interrogate, and indoctrinate over 1 million ethnic Uyghurs and other minorities who are viewed as a threat to the CCP supremacy. The report was apparently disclosed by a sympathetic and unnamed Chinese official seeking to hold President Xi Jinping and the CCP accountable. The 403-page leaked document contains almost 200 pages of internal speeches from Xi and other officials on managing the Uyghur population, and over 150 pages on Uyghur surveillance in Xinjiang. The relatives of disappeared Uyghur family members are told, with a question and answer script, that their family members have been afflicted with a virus of Islamic extremism, that their thinking has been affected by unhealthy thoughts. Many of these family members were never seen again. The international press began to take notice, and many questions were being asked of the CEOs of the major corporations. Let's look at the companies doing business in a country that steals their intellectual property and, under Chinese law, have total control and access of all developed technology. Ironically, some of our most sensitive and important commodities are made in China using slave labor. Semiconductor maker Qualcomm makes 66.6% of its revenue in China. Much of Qualcomm's shipments go to factories that assemble smartphones and other products. China is also home to some of the world's largest smartphone vendors, including Xiaomi, OnePlus, Oppo, Vivo, Lenovo, and others, most of which use Qualcomm chips in their products. Likewise, Broadcom earns about 50% of its revenue in China, according to Tijori Finance. Broadcom is involved in designing, developing, and marketing semiconductor and infrastructure software products. Intel earns 26.5% of its revenue from China, while NVIDIA earns about 23.9%. Apple generates only about 17% of its revenue from China. Boeing, Caterpillar, General Motors, Starbucks, Nike, and Ford are some other U.S. companies with a strong presence in the country, but none of them get more than 25% of their revenue from China. Chief Executive for Nike, John Donahoe, said, "Nike is a brand that is of China and for China," in response to a question about competition from Chinese brands. Mr. Donahoe made the statements during a discussion on Nike's fourth quarter earnings, which showed revenues had doubled to a better-than-expected $12.3 billion for the 3 months to the end of March 2020. Several companies not on this list expressed concerns about the use of Uyghur forced labor in manufacturing, such as in the cotton production and making clothing and shoes for companies such as Nike. The Washington Post found that Apple supplier Lens Technology uses Uyghur workers in its factories, according to documents obtained by the Tech Transparency Project. To illustrate the insane and blatant hypocrisy, the companies Abercrombie & Fitch, Gap, Calvin Klein, Lacoste, The North Face, Polo Ralph Lauren, Skechers, Tommy Hilfiger, and Victoria's Secret, as well as General Motors, Land Rover, Mercedes-Benz, and more companies use slave labor. These companies and many other brands are potentially directly or indirectly benefiting from the use of Uyghur workers outside Xinjiang through abusive labor transfer programs as recently as 2019, according to a report from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Many of these companies prolifically spoke out against racial injustice following the death of George Floyd in May of 2020 and donated to domestic terror group Black Lives Matter, which was founded upon a lie during the Trayvon Martin case in Florida. The terror group, BLM, grew after the false reports regarding the death of Michael Brown in Missouri and perpetuated through public extortion, intimidation, and has been proven to have been a scam. The BLM founders had been stealing donations to live lavish lifestyles, giving not $1 for Black lives. For example, Apple, which has said that it is committed to donating to organizations that challenge racial injustice and mass incarceration, is not the only company to come under scrutiny for its links to slave labor. In a spring 2020 report titled Uyghurs for Sale, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute found that at least 83 popular household name brands are potentially directly or indirectly benefiting from the use of Uyghur workers outside Xinjiang through abusive labor transfer programs. According to the Daily Caller, supported by other independent investigative news organizations, this report estimates that more than 80,000 Uyghurs were transferred out of Xinjiang to work in factories across China between 2017 and 2019, and some of them were sent directly from detention camps. A summary of the report said, the estimated figure is conservative, and the actual figure is likely to be far higher. In factories far away from home, they typically live in segregated dormitories, undergo organized Mandarin and ideological training outside working hours, are subject to constant surveillance, and are forbidden from participating in religious observances, the report continued. Numerous sources, including government documents, show that transferred workers are assigned minders and have limited freedom of movement. In March 2023, a group of Western countries, in a coordinated effort, by the European Union, United Kingdom, United States, and Canada imposed sanctions on officials and their businesses in China over human rights abuses against the mostly Muslim Uyghurs and other minority groups. Several major companies have reportedly fought efforts to end the practice of forced labor, specifically the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which passed the U.S. House of Representatives by a vote of 403 to 6 in September of 2020. Perhaps the greatest sense of blatant irony and incomprehensible hypocrisy is the Disney Corporation selling out to China. Disney censors its films and bows to the will of the Chinese Communist Party just to make a profit. The once familiar, wholesome American entertainment company has collapsed and carved into the demands of the CCP in order to make money in the face of its public stance on human rights. They sold out. In true hypocritical fashion, other industrial giants who went woke just happened to be the greatest defenders of slave labor. Coca-Cola, Nike, Apple, and other corporations fought to weaken the bill's language. The New York Times, again to its credit, reported in late November 2020 that arguing that the bill would harm the supply chains they rely on in China. However, the greatest threat to our nation started when U.S. drug manufacturers outsourced pharmaceutical manufacturing overseas, especially to India and China. This was due to the high cost of doing business, especially under the Obama administration, where companies had to pay higher taxes. Liberal taxation methods drove many businesses overseas, just as the Democrat-operated states in America drove the film industries out of their states with high operating costs. As a result, 80% of our medical supplies and almost 90% of our drugs, including antibacterials, antivirals, and chemotherapy medications, are made in China, where quality control is a major concern. Of greater concern is China's ability to cut off all of those supplies. Of great interest is the blatant hypocrisy and feckless actions by the failed and worthless United Nations Human Rights Council. The UN is a failed organization and has been for years. Although the UN touts that they are the enforcers of human rights, their consistent failure is clearly the result of disinterest, especially when many of the nations appointed to the Council over the years have been the greatest violators of human rights. For example, on the Council have been human rights violators Pakistan, Cuba, China, Somalia, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Rwanda, and Sudan, just to name a few. All have lost credibility, yet they sat on the Human Rights Council. So when you see an American-owned company, such as Walt Disney Corporation, grandstanding about wokeism and human rights, just remember that without slave labor and the crushing oppression of the Chinese Communist Party and the blind eye to these actions by the United Nations, many of these companies would be out of business. Therefore, purchase wisely. Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please click like, subscribe, and share. Send us comments and show ideas, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time.